Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about population growth, or more specifically, declining population growth in the West. Now, I've had a number of postings on my vids and even messages coming directly to me. And I've noticed them around on social media generally. There's a concerted propaganda campaign at the moment to say that, or to try and convince people that the reason there's mass black and brown peasant immigration to the West is only because, and solely because, of the declining Western birth rate. And that decline is so sharp that within a short space of time, so the propagandists allege, there'll be nobody here, no one in the West, not even one person. So that's all they can do. The politicians have no choice. I mean, they would do something else if they could, but they've got no choice. They have to bring these people in. Where will the workers come from? Where will the people working in the health services come from? Where will they come from if not bringing out masses of black and brown peasants? I mean, the government is forced into it. They'd love to do something different, but they've got no choice. It's just how they have to do it. And do you disagree with that, you damn fascist Nazi? So this is the thing, that because the white population growth has fallen off a cliff, white people just aren't procreating anywhere near the rates of other people. And if you look where the population growth is coming from, it's coming from the Indian subcontinent. The population of India over the last 40 years has increased like 20%. Something it's insane. I couldn't believe that in such a dirt poor country where dead bodies are lying in the street, that they can have such a huge rate of procreation. And they've had a very small increase in per capita wealth there, but that's enough for the population to explode. Imagine what it's going to be like if India becomes an even richer country still. Their only export will be their surplus population. And Africa really is going into a sort of similar situation. The natural sort of attrition of sickness and famine, flood, and starvation, the civil wars that were always going on long before the white people turned up. These sorts of things have been, or the effects of them at least, have been minimised. So Africa's population is projected to, I don't know whether it will or not, but some projections have it at more than doubling over the next 35 to 40 years. So we're going to have more than 2 billion, 2.2 and a quarter to 2.5 billion in the Indian subcontinent, and then 2.2 billion people in Africa. And they've got, basket case economies, dirt poor basket case economies, huge surplus populations. And that's going to be just too inviting for the Klaus Schwab and the Davos and the World Economic Forum, the World Bank. It's just it'll be just too tantalizing. And they want to move these people into the West for purely, their own financial gain and no other reason. So, but is this true? Has population in the West declined, and is that the reason why they're bringing, Western governments against the will of the people, excuse me, against the will, why they're bringing out masses of black and brown peasants who are failing utterly to integrate into the local Western society? So let's have a closer look at this now. Following World War, there was World War One, and so there was a bit of a baby boom following the end of World War One. All the soldiers returning from the war, and there was quite a buoyant time. In fact, it was referred to as the Roaring 20s, 1920s. Then the Depression hit, and birth rates sort of declined there. Not as much as you think, because the workforce, particularly with sort of itinerant labourers who were the hardest hit in the Depression. Remember, the unemployment rate was, depending on which country and which time, was between 20 and say 25%, as high as 30% in some places. But the boom of the 1920s had caused, there's a lot of quite well-paid jobs just in straight labouring. If you could hold a hammer and bang in a nail, you could have a decent paying job in that time. So a lot of people gravitated to that sort of work, and farm hands, even that sort of thing. And so there was quite a bit of a birth rate there. The farm hand and the farmer's daughter sort of rolling in the hay and that sort of thing. But there was generally the birth rate sort of declined as these itinerant, or as the depression sort of bit. But you have to remember, there's still 70% of the workforce was still employed, and as the price of goods fell, the standard of living of some people who had a steady government job was actually pretty good during that time, during the depression. So then World War II came along. So when the soldiers came back, and there was huge, remember, it was mass mobilisation of all the nation's resources, both human and material, in those days. And so when they came back from the war, there was this huge baby boom, and it was referred to as the baby boom. And it was sort of generically was given the dates of 1946 to 1961 was sort of generally the what was called the baby boom. The sort of 48 to 51 maybe was the bigger bulge of the births, but and that spread differently. England, for example, was still on rationing for quite a while after the war ended. So the baby boom in England came a little bit later, but it was a boom nonetheless. And it was probably one of the biggest, as in births, the biggest population bulges that I think the Western world had ever seen, and compressed into quite a tight time frame, that 15 years. So now, when that baby boom, that initial sort of hit, if you like, of baby births came in, you'd expect the birth rate to fall. That's hardly surprising. And there are other factors at play as well. Governments across the Western world were encouraging school students, instead of leaving school at 14 or 15 years old, to say, become an apprentice carpenter, or I don't know, electrician, plumber, or whatever, or girls to go and become hairdressers, that sort of stuff. Instead of that, they were started to encourage children to stay on at school and finish, for example, senior high school, spend a year in a community college learning something, or even go to university. Particularly as the late 70s came on, or even in America earlier still. So the kids were staying on longer and incurring various debts, and so they weren't earning money at 14 or 15, and they weren't acquiring the sense of responsibilities and attitudes to responsibility. It wasn't unusual, for example, that people would get married at, he'd be 18, she'd be 17, and they'd have a child within the first 12 months, and people were taking these as myself, as a, I don't know, in those days, as sort of a 10 or 11-year-old, these 18-year-olds with their first baby around, seemed terribly grown up and terribly responsible, as my perception as a child, maybe just starting high school or something. But those days sort of passed, and or those times went by, and so kids coming out of school, they finish, instead of they finish high school at 17 or 18, they'd be 19 by the time they finished community college, or even 21, 22 by the time they finished university. They had debts to meet and that sort of stuff. So they'd be starting life out sort of 7 years, or anywhere between sort of I don't know, 5 to 7, 8 years later than the previous generations were. So, or most of the previous generations. Now, the other thing that was also changing was the relative cost of living. From sort of 1970 onwards, the cost of living started to change quite considerably, and the cost of buying a house and all these sorts of things suddenly were increasing, and the pay wasn't keeping up. So the cost of living began to change, and so it made, not necessarily prohibitive, but it just made it that little bit tougher. And what most people used to do is they wanted to save up for a deposit for a house before they sort of got married, or certainly before they had children, because then it was accepted that the wife would stop work for at least a time, if not, for years to come, or until the child, say, was going to start at primary school, for example. Then the wife may go back to work as part-time or casual or something like that. So those sort of structures of employment similarly were changing, and the cost of living was changing, and people were starting out later. Also, the sense of responsibility that people had. If you start work at 14 and a half years old, by the time you get to sort of 18, 19, you've become, well, not in every case, but you've had sort of a real experience of the world, of paying bills, of paying your way, of making your own way, and that sort of thing, and acquiring a sense of responsibility that really by the 70s, that wasn't the case. So people were delaying having children, and as the cost of living increased, they were having fewer children. Now, at the same time, during the 70s, late 60s, 70s, there was a huge push by what was the embryonic sort of globalist elite, if you like, to try and get more women into the workforce. And to do this, they figured they had to effectively just tear up the marriage contract and just make divorce nice and easy, and to encourage women to divorce. They would sort of guarantee them, well, you can have the kids, the house, and everything. So there was a lot of effort and constant propaganda everywhere that all men were violent, evil oppressors, and marriage was an institution of oppression for women, and they better get out and get a nice job and be treated like shit by the boss or something like that. And that was infinitely more preferable. But it was simply to create more consumers, more workers. And this was also a sort of a byproduct, if you like, of the baby boom dropping off. But if we take the bulge of the baby, say children born in 1948, we'll kind of take a midpoint. It was really 1969 before they were starting to enter the workforce after having completed high school and college and that sort of stuff. And so the likely situation and circumstances were less favourable for procreation, marriage and procreation and that sort of thing than they had been earlier, and certainly became even less so again as the 70s progressed. So the effect of demonising marriage and demonising the marriage contract, and encouraging women to go to work and to see or perceive men as oppressors, and very Marxist, of course, in the structure of that propaganda at the time, as indeed we see today with race and race hustling and all that sort of stuff. So the conditions were less than perfect for the sort of procreation that, for example, had been the case in the baby boom. So people would have three, 4 children. It was, even when I was a kid, it wasn't unusual to see 3 or 4 families with 4 children, for example. And I knew families that had 5, 6, 7 children. This one family had 13 children, for Christ's sakes. I don't know how they did it. And yet the guy, if I remember, because they weren't that far from where I was, and I was buddies with one of the kids, and the father there, 13 kids running around. The place was mayhem 24/7. And he was the most calm, sort of relaxed. He could just sort of switch off and just let the mayhem occur around. I don't know how he did it, but anyway. So large families weren't unusual, but they became so quite quickly, and cost, of course, being a primary factor in that, and also, in my view, at least, the instability of the marriage contract also contributed to that. Now, there was other factors there. The activism on university campus was that we're all going to die in a nuclear war any minute now. And I remember the kids running around at the time, uni kids and whatnot. Well, they weren't kids; they were older than me at the time. But they talking about, well, the world's going to end tomorrow, so why the fuck do we have children, given it's about to end? And even as a kid, I used to think, well, how do they know it's going to end? Do they know something that I don't? And so, and it was, it wasn't an unreal consideration, but it was a huge beat up from what the real risks were. They were, heavily overstating the risks and then using that as an excuse not to either A, get married, or B, to procreate. But as time went on, that the pressure, if you like, again from that embryonic globalist thing, was to force more and more women to work, more and more pressure on the marriage and marriage contract, more and more propaganda about evil male oppressors and that sort of thing, which made marriage on a relative basis less attractive to women and less attractive for men. So fewer people were getting married. When they were getting married, they were getting married later. And if they had a choice between consumer goods in the sense of buying a house and buying a car, having annual vacations overseas, that sort of thing, then they were tending to change their attitudes to one of not procreation and family, but of consumerism. Again, pushed heavily by the globalists who wanted increased consumer activity and buying consumer goods. And by the way, there are a lot more consumer goods to buy. The electronics home gadget boom, for example. I remember sort of the kitchen of my grandmother and then the kitchen of my mother in terms of the amount of gadgets that were in it. It was two different worlds. I mean, the technology that brought the gadgets didn't exist when my grandmother was a young woman, yet they were all over the place when I was a kid. So there was a changing structure of society in those sort of terms as well, which didn't keep women in the house to the extent that they might have. Even the pure act of having to bake bread, for example, ties you down to the kitchen for hours, and in the meantime you look after the children, that sort of thing. Also, the idea of today, children, sort of young children, even sort of they want their smartphone and their designer label clothes and the Nike joggers, and they want all the brand names. And I as a kid that age, I didn't even know what a brand name was. I had no idea. My folks would buy stuff from wherever, they'd give it to me, and that would be it. I wouldn't think about, other than did it fit or not, I wouldn't think about the brand or was it cool or uncool, or it didn't even occur to me. I probably was, 14 before those sort of things entered even my cognizance, 15 maybe. You didn't sort of think about it then in the way that even 8-year-olds may think about it now. So the consumer society was also changing the structure, and people were having fewer children in preference to being able to access consumer goods. Whereas, certainly when I was a kid, consumer goods weren't that much of an issue, or not as much as they are now. And this idea that you would go without. As a kid, I'd walk to school and walk for miles without even thinking about it. There was this idea there were pedophiles everywhere, and if it wasn't pedophiles, it would be Hitler, and if it wasn't Hitler, it would be there. That's this idea of bogeymen everywhere and monsters under the bed didn't exist when I was a kid, but they are sort of everywhere now. And the idea of kids walking somewhere is in many communities now unthinkable. Your folks have got to get the car out and drive you there and pick you up. So anyway, this changed the entire social structure and the substructures that would have otherwise underpinned procreation, and then other things came along as once globalization started to take. A lot of people say, "Well, gee, I don't want to bring kids in the West. I don't want to bring kids into the world in a Western country. They'll be a minority in their own country in another 10, 20 years." And they'll be treated like shit by the black and the brown people who'll be running the show. So I don't want to have children and subject them to that. And others on the other side will say, well, climate change, the world's going to end tomorrow because of climate change. So I don't want to have children into that. And without realizing it's just a globalist play to take control of things. So in the end, if we look at sort of right across the board, Western procreation has been discouraged to the max. Now, there were many things Western governments could have done, such as offering substantial tax incentives for families to procreate, returning some sort of solidity and sanctity to the marriage contract, which they've doggedly refused to do all across the Western world. Now, if they do that, though, it means there'll be fewer women in the workforce. More women having children means they're having babies, maybe looking after them, even if it's for a year. It's still looking after them. The cost of childcare is so high now that women on ordinary incomes will say, well, it's hardly worth them working, because by the time they've paid all the childcare and the associated costs with that, they're barely better off than if they weren't working at all. So unless they really like the job and they find it exciting and stimulating and that sort of thing, then why would they bother, going to work? They might as well stay at home. That's not what Western governments, certainly not what the globalists want. They want to keep women's participation. In fact, even now, the globalists still complain women's participation in the West, by the way, is still not high enough. They want it higher because it's men's participation. For example, men's participation rate is, for example, 98%. I don't think it's that high, but for example, whereas women's participation rate is 65%. So the globalists look at that disparity of numbers and say, well, gee whiz, there's 20 plus percent more of women that, or even 30% more of women can go to work, which means more workers, more tax, more consumerism, and so on. So we've got to push this. Let's put out a thing saying the reason they're not working isn't because they're lazy or don't want to, or the shit jobs. The reason they're not working is because Hitler is stopping them, and then that justifies us getting them out into that workforce. So all these things in combination and aggregation have caused white Western people to stop procreating or to have, one child instead of three. And, myself among them, for goodness sakes. So when we look at that, that's why. Now, Western governments could have taken, action in the way that, say, Viktor Orban is in Hungary, to encourage families to have children. And it would have, I believe, easily addressed the shortfall of births that the government sort of statisticians allegedly fret about. But the Western governments did not. They did nothing to encourage increases in births. In fact, they did the opposite. They did everything they could, in my view, to discourage white people from having children, and then to turn around and say, there's not enough children. That's why we have to import the black and brown illiterate peasants from the third world. I mean, what bullshit! What chutzpah! Goodness me, that annoys me. That is simply not the reason. They want to stuff as many people into the functioning consumer economies of the world, and they're going to where the surplus populations are, India and Africa and other parts of Asia, and taking as many of those illiterate peasants that the West does not need, and bringing them here without the consent of the people. So that's my take on Western birth rates and population decline. And but there is a propaganda campaign going on at the moment to justify the mass migration by saying that, well, white people won't have babies, so what else can we do? That's bullshit, and it's a completely concocted reason, and it should be dismissed out of hand. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.